Degree Qualifications Profile. I've given you a handout, and I'll be referring at various points to some of the pages in that handout which say more than we'll have time to say, Jim and I, about different things. But the Degree Qualifications, first of all, how many of you have actually read it? And how many of you have not read the Degree Qualifications Profile? All right, so for some of you, this is new terrain. For some of you, you've already thought about this. There's actually 220 campuses that are experimenting with it, about 120 through various Lumina-funded projects, including one that AAC&U has organized. But there's another 100 that have just picked it up and are doing something with it on their own. On page 3 of this handout, I've given you a sort of Cliff Notes overview of the Degree Qualifications Profile. Lumina refuses to produce the one-page summary. AAC&U specializes in one-page summaries, and here it is. What it was intended to be was a bold effort to get beyond the early 20th century organizing principles for the major and reconceive, I'm sorry, the major, for the degree, reconceive the degree in terms of 21st century components. So 100 years ago plus, breadth followed by depth became the way we thought about the relationships between the broad and the specialized part of the curriculum. And I know from the general education discussion I was listening to before, a lot of you are well beyond that, in fact, but we still do think in terms of breadth and depth. So the Degree Qualifications Profile is an attempt to say a good degree contains the following components. It contains broad integrative knowledge, which you'll recognize right away. It's another term for general education. It includes specialized knowledge, which of course is what you're working on in tuning your discipline. It includes a set of intellectual skills that will take different forms in different disciplines, but those skills ought to be found in every discipline. It ought to include civic learning. We're educating citizens, not just knowledgeable people, but knowledgeable people in the world's most powerful democracy. And we need to be thinking about how that is mapped into the educational experience. And then applied learning, which is probably the most adventurous part of this. We're saying that it's not enough to know and understand. You really need to be able to apply your learning to some complex project, of which the ability to write a research paper in history would be, in my mind, as an historian, Exhibit A. But there are all kinds of other forms of applied learning that matter in other fields. And basically we're saying the real test of a 21st century education is whether a student can apply. I think the major concern that, and you may want to chime in, the major concern we've encountered is an assumption that if you try to name the component elements of a degree, you are dangerously far over the line towards standardization. And as soon as you, and you're hearing this in history too, as soon as you have standardized, the standardized test is sure to follow. And I'd like to make common cause with all of you, the people who wrote. First of all, Degree Qualifications Profile, it's a first draft. It is intended to be revised. It's out there for dialogue and debate and experimentation. It's what's in the portfolio that shows whether or not a student is becoming more adept at tackling, defining, bringing evidence to bear on big questions, significant problems, and doing something with them. So the critique is, we're standardizing the degree. I know this is more than 140 words. The critique is we're standardizing the degree, but the reality is we want to make common cause with those who are moving students' own authentic work to the center of assessment. Because the authority we have is a communal authority, it's a collaborative authority. It comes from whether or not the work we're doing together is helpful to those who are trying to educate our students. The authority question, of course, is all about Lumina, and I'm sure I don't need to tell you that. You're in the AHA project, we're in the DQP project, and the question in people's minds is who the hell is Lumina? And how do they get to say what the degree is about?
How many of you run into that on your campuses, by the way, just so that we know? Not very many.
Who's Lumina?
Who is Lumina and what business do they have telling us what to do, basically? How many of you run into that, just as a curiosity? Okay.
What I see is that Lumina is actually using its considerable resources to create a dialogue we need to have in higher education. They're inviting us to come into this question. What is the degree about? How do the different fields that are central to the degree, how should they be shaped so that they're really powerful for the students who study in those fields? I see them doing their very best to get us to take ownership of the future of undergraduate education. And they do have the advantage of having the resources to create that kind of a dialogue. But this work will only be as valuable as you collectively and we collectively make it. So we are the only association that works on undergraduate liberal education. The only one, which should sober all of us. We see that this will have authority only to the extent that the faculty collectively and the academic administrators who work with you and stakeholders in the community, as they see value in this, it will be valuable.
One of the questions that's been posed about tuning in our community of historians is the sort of tripod of education for what you call education for democracy, education for citizenship, education to get a job, and history education because of the passion for history. And I'm kind of curious as to how, in talking about and thinking about the DQP, AAC&U has thought about that triangle of things and thought about how not to make it one versus the other.
Right. Well, I think there's not a simple answer to that question, Jim.
That's why I didn't give you 140 words this time.
Right. Before we signed on to help Lumina draft, and I'm one of the authors of the DQP, before we signed on to do this, we had been working, as you said, for a long time and very publicly and intentionally since 2005 on an effort to update the redefinition of what liberal or liberal arts education is about. We use the term liberal education. It's the 19th century term. It's the 18th century term. I'm an historian. But we also wanted to clarify the distinction between the liberal education approach to learning and what a small liberal arts college does. It has a particular style of coming at that, but too many people think liberal arts education only happens in the small liberal arts college, and that is not good for society.
Actually, let me stop there too. How many of you who are not at liberal arts colleges have difficulty explaining to people that students get a liberal arts education at your university or at your college? Okay, so some of you do have this.
So basically, we had tried to outline the key elements in the liberal education, and they are on page 2 of your handout. And if you spend a little time on this, you'll, I think, see a pretty clear crosswalk between what we were already working on and what's in the DQP. The argument we were making is that the kind of learning we need has to happen across all disciplines. Passionate though I personally am about the humanities, I think it would be very unfortunate if you got a liberal education only in the humanities and social sciences. We want to make sure that students who are going to be health workers, teachers, engineers are also broadly educated. And by just listening to employers, frankly, and listening to our own colleagues, it became clearer and clearer, and we provided evidence to this, that the very capabilities you're working on in the history major, and that we as an association have been broadly working on as good outcomes of liberal education, this is what employers want more of, not less. We've repeatedly surveyed employers to find out what they think students need to do to be promotable in their careers. One little snapshot of that is on the page 4 of your handout. There's a much longer set of surveys which you can find online. They are friendly to liberal and liberal arts education. They are friendly to the tuning work you're doing. Some of you already know this because you're surveying employers too. We have a new, I want you to know, we have a new survey that's about to be released in April. And it will be even friendlier. It's got more information on employers' valuing of civic questions, ethical reasoning, the ability to engage disputed positions in a way that's productive. Watch for this new survey, it'll be out in April, but this is the old one. So we try to pull it all together in terms of the learning that is good for life, the learning that is good for democracy, also turns out to be useful in your careers.
So if that's what you're hearing from employers, why is there an ever louder discourse over the past, say, 12 to 18 months in the United States, suggesting that history majors, liberal arts in general, but especially humanities, are somewhat less than useful? If you're hearing from employers that it's incredibly useful, where's this? I'm curious as to the media suggests this is coming from the business community, so I'm curious as to how you see this
Right.
dissonance.
It's not coming from the business community. Repeatedly, we've documented this in surveys going back to 2006. Most recently, the one that isn't released, employers do not want narrow learning. They do not think that that is what employers are driven by the need to innovate. If an organization is not innovating, it is not moving forward. They want people who can think outside the box, who are not, and I'm quoting, locked into mental cubicles, and who can help them with the creative work that they're engaged in doing. I think there are two issues at stake that are getting in our way. One is, frankly, of our own making. The way in which we have described liberal or liberal arts education has been so opaque, so ridden with terms that are not meaningful outside the academy. Is it the core? Is it gen ed? Is it liberal arts? Is it the back core? Is it university studies? Is it liberal arts? Is it liberal education? You know, it's very confusing.
And remember, actually, that's interesting because of what tuning is, which is, many of you will remember when we first started this project, what we emphasized was vocabulary.
Right.
That's, in a sense, the starting point was this distance between the vocabulary that we use and the vocabulary that the rest of the world uses in terms of thinking about history, and the inability of our students to articulate what it is they're doing that's useful, as Dan was saying at the end of the last session, which in part is due to our inability to articulate that.
So that is definitely one issue, the confusing vocabulary and the failure to give students, who are our graduates, who are out there in the real world, any useful vocabulary to describe in a reflective way, not just the content they dug into, but the capabilities they brought with them. So that's the first one. The second one, I think, has to do with the completion agenda. And here, you know, I believe I'm on tape, our Lumina colleagues have been funders of the completion agenda, and entirely too many people funded through that believe that the best way to solve our employment problem is to get students into narrowly defined short-term programs and into the workplace. And so there's been a discussion about that, and most of the certificate programs that people want to invest in are liberal learning free zones. They just are. But the third has to do with the politics of it. The fact of the matter is, you know, and you know this, the universities and colleges are perceived as left-leaning and progressive. And so there is an identification out there. We have documentation of this from our own public opinion research that, especially your high school students, you ask them, what does the term liberal education mean to you? They write it down. Oh, is this something Rush Limbaugh would disapprove of? You know, they don't know what we're actually about, but they do know that the society is riven between this debate between liberals and conservatives. And there's been an organized effort, as was alluded to in one of the earlier sessions, over 40 years to defund the progressive part of the academy. They've been very successful in defunding the humanities at the federal level. NEH, 154 million compared to the billions and billions that go into other fields. Just last week, Eric Cantor argued that we should be redirecting funding now going to the social sciences, to other areas. This is not accidental. This is not accidental, it's quite deliberate, and it has to do with draining the progressive discussions that happen on many college, university, and community college campuses. Have agreed to be advocates for liberal education. They're part of LEAP. And they are reaching out to sign up employers to sign a statement which describes liberal education broadly and says we want more of it, and we pledge to help our people we're hiring, people in our own companies use this language, know better what it is that will contribute to long-term success in our companies. And that the reason we're sitting on the current survey is we want to release the employer statement and the survey together to try to get maximum attention to it. And then the hope is that campuses around the country will have their own local dialogues about, look, this is what contributes to economic success and civic vitality in our society. This is what we're doing here at Colorado College or JMU or IUPUI or Utah State or wherever to actually provide this kind of education. And these are the employers who actually believe in it. So we are hoping that we can push forward a broad, concerted effort to fight the current aspersions that say that narrow learning is all that you really need to get a good job.
And I would strongly encourage you to try to think about doing that, because I think it's one thing on your campus to say, well, the American Association of Colleges and Universities has found that nationally business people like to see it. It's one thing to say that to parents and first-year students and administrators. It's another thing to say our survey of our local community tells us that the business people around here want our graduates to have these this variety of skills, is interest in these kinds of majors. I think there's different levels of influence here. Please raise your hand if you have questions.
I cut somebody off before.
Yeah, Lendl has one, but I have questions, but your questions are probably better. So, Lendl, you had a question.
Yeah, Carol, I was talking to a business major a couple weeks ago, and I said, look, we have survey data showing that people in the business community really want to see more liberal arts majors, including history majors, blah, blah, blah. And the business major said, well, that's cool that CEOs want to see more historians, but can you assure me that the personnel office that I'm interviewing with wants to see more history majors?
Right.
And I said, you should be a history major too. Yeah, can you say a word about that?
Good answer. The surveys we're doing are not just of CEOs. I'm glad you asked that, and for exactly the reason that you have just specified. So basically the surveys are going to people who are involved in hiring decisions, including HR people, not just the CEOs. And the compact is being signed again at multiple levels. So we actually have some, God knows, not nearly enough frontline recruiters signing it, but also HR people and also vice presidents and CEOs. But I have to be honest, we have not even been surveying the question whether employers want to see more history majors. Before we surveyed, we had focus groups, and when we commissioned these surveys, we did not ask questions that were going to be disadvantageous to the academy. The fact of the matter is there isn't a demand for more liberal arts, humanities, history, English majors, etc. People aren't thinking at that level. What they are saying is that more than the major, what really matters is whether or not a student can write, can think outside of the box, has some ethical responsibility, is proactive, can put things together, can move with us, and then I would argue that there is good evidence to show that liberal arts studies produce that kind of capability at higher levels.
And one of the things that you have, by the way, as a resource here is the discipline core, which you can obviously reword, adapt to your own campus, but then you can boil that down. And if you're doing comparable surveys, you can basically put that on the table or in meetings and say, is this what you want? And see what kind of response you get. Yeah?
Yeah. It seems to me there's something of a disconnect between what happens when you ask, say, employers and personnel offices what they want to see in people and then what they advertise for. Because increasingly, I mean, I find it very discouraging. Every time there is a career fair of any sort on our campus, they send out these flyers and they say, oh, we have businesses and they're very interested in hiring people in accounting and this and that and the other. They have a whole list of things and not one liberal major or one set of skill sets that seems to reflect a liberal major is mentioned. And yet I know that we've got all these surveys saying that that's the skill set they really want. So how do we deal with this sort of disconnect as they seem to advertise for jobs with one particular background, but actually what they want somehow to get out of that search of an employee with a completely different background?
Marianne, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yes, I just we have started our conversation with our career services people, and they tell us how you deal with that. That you go as a liberal arts major to those fairs and how you handle what you can bring to those jobs, even though they seem to be very narrowly focused. And I think that is an opportunity for us to talk with people who think very differently from us, but who can give us the tools with which we can have those conversations and who allow us to have those conversations with our students. And it has been very productive it's beginning to be very productive on our campus, I should say.
And picking up on that, with which I completely agree, we've got to coach ourselves, frankly, and our students. It's not the major. The major is the place in which you developed capacities that have value in the marketplace. Critical thinking capacities, information analysis capacities, problem-solving capacities, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's the first point. We've got to teach them we can't have this fight on the basis of majors. This country needs lots of different areas of study. What we need to have it on is the kind of commitments you're here to address, whether or not our students are actually developing the skill sets, the inquiry competence, et cetera, the research skills and experience that will be valuable to them. So that's the first point. But the second is to be, our students already know this and we might as well recognize it too. Let's be practical. It is not useful in today's world, much less today's economy, to have only one subject strength in your portfolio. This is what I was a trustee at my own alma mater, Mount Holyoke College. They didn't care, the people who were hiring from Mount Holyoke, whether or not you had majored in economics. They did care whether you had some quantitative competence. They did care that there had been some experience, could be a course, optimally both, that actually related to the financial industries that were hiring liberal arts graduates. So I think we've got to counsel our students, put together a program that has strength in history, if that's what you're studying, but that adds to it some other dimensions. My own son, humanities major, social science major, one communications course. He's now in sports communications. He parlayed that plus an internship into a very nice early launch career. We've got to be realistic about this. It's not just the major.
Andrew?
I think it's also really important to remember that when we promote liberal education, we also need to make sure that history is squarely in the center of that. And what I mean by that is, what I see happen a lot of the time is because of the cultural turn and also because of the new historicism. History is kind of everywhere and nowhere in general education programs. And so if we just look at the essential learning outcomes, and by the way, this is exactly what just happened on my campus, and we're in the middle of a gigantic debate about it. It looks like we're going to win, but it's happening right now. There is one of the most important things that historians do. We look at qualitative sources. We look at quantitative sources too, but a lot of us look at qualitative sources to analyze human behavior and experience. It's actually not there. And this was the core of most gen ed programs. This is what great books courses were all about. This is what document readers are all about. So one of the most essential things that we do, and then the result is history courses don't find a place there. So something like qualitative literacy, which is the fact that quantitative literacy, everyone would say, oh, of course that belongs there. But qualitative literacy, that you know how to look at something that someone else has written and analyze it.
I think that's a very good point, and one of our own intentions is to, this document's been out here for a while, take a fresh look at it over the course of the next 3 or 4 years. That's a very good suggestion. I do hope you notice the word histories, however, right up there in the essential learning outcomes. And we as an association, we've just released our latest strategic plan, will double down, frankly, on the content part of a liberal education. I think we've tilted too far toward the capabilities part. Absent certain kinds of knowledge, you can't be well-educated or liberally educated.
The other thing, Andrew, is that you can turn that into a strength, which is one of the things that we've emphasized in tuning, is by looking at the discipline core, what is it that the history major has and brings to the table that the other majors do not? And as long as these kinds of skills are outside the DQP, that actually helps us explain to our students some of the things that they bring to the table that maybe the other their colleagues don't. So being absent is not necessarily a bad thing. We maintain that our contribution. I'd like to move the conversation to assessment, which is always controversial or often controversial. And tuning, of course, emphasizes definable outcomes, and in part tuning emphasizes definable outcomes in order to enable and facilitate assessment. And Carol, I know that on your website it says that AAC&U has been working on assessment for 3 decades. And we all know the level of, we all know what the obstacles are on all of our campuses to even just the discourse of assessment. So I'm curious, 3 decades is a long time. Why is this still so controversial? Why is it still so difficult for us to think about how to do this if you guys have been working on this for 3 decades?
Because we're not all powerful.
Well, that's obviously one. That proves you're not all powerful.
Absolutely, it certainly does. Let me answer that, or begin to answer it with a couple of stories. When I came to AAC&U, as you mentioned, I was the executive vice president, and I inherited an early effort to get assessment up and running to do so in partnership with faculty in the disciplines. So I forget the title of the project, but it actually involved 18 institutions and 54 departments, a big chunk of which were history and English departments. And the whole project had been organized and was up and running before I was even hired. So I was like an anthropologist, really, going around visiting what's going on here, what is happening. You cannot imagine the distinction between the conversation you are having now and I was listening to this morning and what was going on in that project across the country, from San Jose State, which was in it, to several colleges in the South, which were in it, and New England as well. I'll go back to that in a minute. They could barely conceptualize the question. You are so far down the path of trying to think what needs to be there in the educational experience, how do we have to organize it so that we could assess it. I assure you I never heard the word rubric in that project, and a lot of you are talking very knowledgeably about your rubrics, your portfolios, your senior capstones. Here's what stood out for me as an historian in that project, 1989. As an undergraduate at Mount Holyoke, I had research papers from the day I walked in the door in almost every course, and certainly in every history course. That's how I got to be a good analyst. I did it constantly. It had never occurred to me that you could have a history major without a research paper. What was it we were supposed to be doing? You knew you would forget the information.
How many of you have a history major without a research paper requirement?
Just
Only
one.
Stefan. Okay.
Right.
We'll
And
get into that later,
aren't you
Stefan.
in a research university?
Absolutely.
Right, exactly. So
Now we know why Stefan has seceded from his history.
So I'm going down to LSU and University of Mississippi and University of Alabama and several other major research universities. And I discovered they've come into this project to add a research seminar, the first, to their majors, so that they can, and they don't really care very much about assessment, but they do actually think there ought to be some research piece. Some of them are putting capstones in. That's then. And now almost all of you are talking about capstones. Is there anybody who doesn't have some kind of a capstone? Okay, so we have 3 hands in a room of 60 people that don't have either research or a capstone. You can go back, the 3 of you, and point that out.
Tried it.
And our last employer survey, the one called Raising the Bar, does say that employers believe a senior research project would be a very useful piece of information to have about whether or not the student is ready for the job market. So that's, if we have to be crass about it, we can go that route too. But at any rate, the point is that the remapping of history in a more intentional way had to happen before you could do assessment well. We're still struggling with assessment, but and hard though it is, and I know it's hard, far more progress has been made. One of the joys of getting older is that you get to see history changing, changing before your eyes, and we are making much more progress. Still tough. We haven't and one of the problems is the graduate departments, as far as I know, do not address it. And therefore, everybody starts out remedial once they hit campus. So that's another piece of it. But I want to underscore, you've made a huge amount of progress over the last 20-some years.
So let's try to combine where we started with this. AAC&U has been emphasizing college education, liberal education, as preparation for civic participation, education for a democratic society. How do you envision assessing whether or not an institution has been successful at educating its students to be participants in a democratic society? I mean, we've seen all the nonsense about how they assess the success in terms of employment rates, in terms of salaries, a lot of it's silliness. But how do you envision assessing whether or not a given college or university has educated productive citizens?
Right. Well, if you've noticed the way this page on the Degree Qualifications Profile is laid out, you'll see certain words are bolded. The word integrate is bolded a lot, but just look at the things that are bolded under civic learning, because we tried to provide an answer to that question on civic learning specifically. That a student is demonstrating his or her ability to integrate both knowledge and skills, intellectual skills, in analyzing and addressing significant public problems and questions. And that could be done through research, through collaborative projects, and/or field-based assignments. But that goes again to the design of our programs. It wasn't clear to me, frankly, that the core competencies you've written thus far in history insist that students deal with contested public questions. Now, I know that happens all the time, in fact, in history courses and departments, but do students know? I mean, do you help them make the connection between questions they may be debating, like the history of inequality in the United States, for example, and debates we're having as a civil society? Are we making those connections explicit for them? And are we expecting there to be something in their portfolio of work that shows that they have actually tackled a significant public question? Or, as is entirely too often the case, we're leaving all that to Gen Ed, which may or may not be doing it well, but is sending a message. Our majors don't care about these questions.
John?
Well, I wanted to come at this a little differently. So, I mean, as an assessment tool, I mean, part of this, therefore, has to be about a student's ability to communicate.
Yeah.
Right? And communicate, I would think, for civic learning, to be able to communicate with a wide variety of audiences across a wide variety of platforms, potentially.
Or to work with people across a wide,
well,
right.
that too.
Yes.
So in other words, what they need to be able to do is they need to be able to demonstrate that they can be persuasive and constructive working
Right.
with somebody who doesn't share their values, their assumptions. to start
Exactly,
with.
exactly. And how many of you are, your campuses, if not your departments, are using portfolios? This is a movement that is steaming forward, a little disorganized cottage industry all across higher education. And the evidence of whether or not students are working on public questions with people whose views are different than their own or experiences are different than their own will be in those portfolios. And part of what we hope to do through our own work, but also through our partnership with the DQP and with tuning, is to drive forward the notion that there ought to be some civic evidence in those portfolios. We can start by saying what's there now. A lot of your students are doing volunteer work, but is that ever connected back to what happens in the history major? A lot of them are doing service learning. They may be working with your local campus center for civic engagement and service learning. I love the example that Marianne gave from IUPUI about civil discourse is actually a theme for the whole institution. Well, what is that actually going to mean for the kind of assignments you're giving students, for the work they're producing, and for evidence of whether or not they're even tackling these questions? I have seen a major historian whose field was actually the study of democracy, I will not name him, look at the list of essential learning outcomes, this is within the last decade, and say very decisively, with all the authority of a very major research university, the first two parts of this list are our responsibility. The knowledge, the intellectual skills. The rest of it, that's not our responsibility. Well, as long as that is a view of people who are influential in major graduate schools, then we are going to be struggling very hard to make the case that liberal education is indispensable for democracy, because the connections are not well mapped.
It sounds like one of my former colleagues. But I'm just very curious, very quickly, how many of you have as part of the major some kind of activity, whether it's an internship or something, with a local public history institution in order to tie people into civic culture?
Required or not?
How many required?
Just
How
a
many
few.
optional?
Right.
Wow.
Right.
How many of you would like the AHA to try to put some work into tying you to those kinds of institutions? Okay, we can do that. Okay, you got a question?
But I want to pick up on that. Civic engagement and learning is optional on almost every college and university and community college campus in the country. Somewhere on every one of them, there's something going on that people are doing. But democracy shouldn't be elective. This is our shared responsibility.
Democracy shouldn't be elective. Now there's a really, there's a wonderful way of phrasing it.
It should be something where we say part of what education is for at all levels is to build the capacity to sustain a democracy. It's not a given that it's a self-sustaining enterprise.
Yeah, and then in the back.
Yeah, I'm John Savajan, Associate Dean in Humanities at Alverno College.
Long-term partner.
Long-term partner. And we don't, as history, we don't have a civic engagement outcome for our history major.
Don't you have something like social responsibility?
Well, we have civic engagement, but I guess my point is, when you're starting out creating these things, you can't do everything. And that doesn't mean that civic engagement shouldn't be something important on a campus, and somebody should be doing it, and maybe it can be something you can certainly talk about. But you can't have courses that are all kitchen sink in terms of outcomes. There has to be some selection process. And if it took 30 years to get to this point, and for us almost 40, to make these decisions and figure out where this is going to go, if you start by having this gigantic list of outcomes, you're just going to freak out everybody on the campus. So it's a word of caution. You have to have these conversations locally as to what you want to do. And just because you're not assessing it doesn't mean you're not teaching it either.
That's true, but it may mean in the same way that you've already discussed for tuning that you're not giving the students a vocabulary with which they can explain how their education is in fact building civic capacity as well, and civic problem-solving capacity, which is pretty similar, frankly, to work-related problem-solving capacity. But I'm reasonably certain that when, I haven't looked at the Alverno institutional outcomes for a while, but I'm reasonably certain there's some language in your 8 categories that is relatable to this in your vocabulary.
Yes, we have a specific outcome on civic engagement.
Yeah.
My point is that most of these, a lot of these institutions don't have institutional outcomes that are all integrated, that are coherent across there. And so when you're working from one spot and you're radiating outward, you have to figure, you need to bring other people into the program that are across the institution.
I agree with that. And part of what we say in some of the workshops that we've done using the ELOs on page 2 is to put people in departmental groups and say which of these does not matter at all. AAC&U shouldn't have put this on the list. And frankly, there's nothing there that people don't think is important. That's why they're on the list. Which is not important to our department. And I think it is a reasonable decision for an institution to make that it wants its integrative learning or its personal and social responsibility learning to go on in general education, especially if there's an advanced piece to general education, and not just not in the department. But I really would query whether it's a good idea for a history department to say civic learning is not our responsibility. The connection between the study of history and knowing who you are as a society, as a democracy, your role in the world is so fundamental.
Yeah.
I was wondering if I might be a devil's advocate, or at least a Republican's advocate. I live in Texas.
Texas, which is organizing to be a leap state. I hope you know that.
I do. Some of the folks in Texas, we've got the definition here of civic learning. You described it. I think you say it to all of us in this room, and we say, yes, that's what it means. There are people in my community and in my legislature who, when you say the word citizenship, none of this is what comes to their mind when they talk about citizenship. They have a very different definition of citizenship.
And what would it be? What would it be?
Well, I'll give a couple examples.
No, and I think we should take this seriously because the point is to engage just perspectives different from our own. Well, okay.
When they redid the K through 12 standards, they removed every instance of the word democracy.
For republic?
In favor of a constitutional republic.
Okay.
So they're playing very much with that word.
Right.
Same way they play with the word liberal. The words are landmines, and they will avoid those.
Right.
The Texas Republican Party platform this past year
I'm aware.
had a line in it. There was a line about critical thinking, and they said, oops, talk shows made light of that. But if you read the entire line in context, it was saying things about not challenging authority, not questioning. And so citizenship has a very much meaning that you are respectful, that you are deferential, that you honor the flag, that you honor people who fight for your country. And these are when they talk citizenship, these are the words that come out. And when we talk back saying it's about questioning and challenging, and they come back saying it's about respect, it's about honor, and it's a fundamental disagreement. And we both will run around and say, I'm for citizenship, I'm for citizenship, but we mean totally different things.
We-
Do you have a problem with collaborative as well?
I don't know.
Because there's that whole individualism.
Right. So we have done focus groups, admittedly not in Texas, but with Republican leaders and with Democratic leaders. And the word that resonates across both groups, but stronger with Republicans and perhaps with conservatives, is responsibility. And there is a reason why we personally, why AAC&U has chosen personal and social responsibility. I think going there, you can get to, it'll still be a debate about what it means to be responsible, but you can have a point of discussion about what civic responsibility really ought to add up to, and whether or not doing for others is in fact being sufficiently addressed in the educational experience. But the other point I would make in terms of your particular situation is, it's a balancing act. We're preparing students for democracy and citizenship. We're preparing them for work. You can find employers, I know this, in Texas, to come to the table and say, the refusal to ask questions will be a problem for our company. So I think you figure out who your allies are and work with them.
I would also argue that one response to that would be, yes, and our campus is the best place to have a respectful and responsible conversation about those different visions of citizenship. That becomes, quite frankly, the purpose of the academy in that environment.
Exactly. And
Also,
let me just
yeah.
say one more thing. In the survey we haven't released yet, 91% of the responding employers would like to see colleges and universities spend more time teaching people how to solve problems in the face of disagreement. 91%.
Yeah, we'll stay in the back and then we'll come back to Texas if Linda still has her question. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead, all the way in the back, yeah.
I want to kind of track on what he was saying and go back to what he said earlier about a dialogue. Because in Texas, U.S. history is the only history requirement. Students have to take in the general ed,
Right.
2 courses, U.S. history,
Right.
subject Texas history. Now our coordinating board has said for general education that this course you have to assess personal responsibility, not the decision making. I'm not even sure Chief is aware of that, because my school just locked down.
I can't quite hear you. He's aware of it because your
He's
school.
not aware of it because his school's not dealing with this yet. It's not due to 2014. My school is.
Where are you?
I'm at San Antonio College by the Alamo College.
Okay, yeah.
District. And the thing, my faculty are saying, first of all, nobody knows what LEAP is within my entire system. So the coordinating board adopted this. It's not matriculating now in faculty. And second of all, how am I assessing and measuring ethical reasoning? And am I equipped to do so? Is that my training? I'm not against the personal social responsibility, but the way it's getting communicated to us,
Right.
and with this assessment and everything, are you aware of what's going on from your kind of top level?
I mean, we have staff running back and forth to Texas all the time, but am I aware of everything that's going on? Certainly, absolutely not. And we need your advice on how to proceed, frankly, with Texas, which is basically organizing its own LEAP Inc. and collecting dues yourselves, I've learned. Interesting.
Speaking of business models.
Speaking of business models. But the question of how we would assess ethical reasoning takes me back to my own early moments in teaching when students raised fundamental ethical questions as I was busily teaching the ancient Greek society, and I realized how incompetent I was to deal with the ethical dimensions of things. This is why we have interdisciplinarity. This is not for the history department to solve by itself, but there are good protocols for actually working through ethical reasoning about disputed, contested issues, taking into account multiple dimensions of the problem. And what I would look for, personally, if I were sitting at the table with you trying to come up with this, is for the student herself to take a stand and have a reason for taking a stand. Reasoned judgment. I read my son's sophomore humanities papers from Boston College not all that long ago. And every paper he wrote was all about great texts and great books, dealt with authors who had struggled with major moral questions, and never in one of those papers did I see my own son say, "Here is what I think." So he could say what Dostoevsky was getting at, or he could say what Lincoln was getting at, et cetera, et cetera. But here is what I think. And I think that's the opportunity that the social responsibility, ethical reasoning opens up for us. It's to help students connect the scholarly analysis you want them to be able to do with judgments they themselves finally have to make. When there is no right, nobody's going to be able to say this is right or this is wrong. But you are going to have to come to some decision on which you would act. Values are standards for action. And that's what I would get to, but I wouldn't try to do it alone with just the history department.
We're coming up close to lunch now, but let's a few more short questions and short answers. Patty, short question.
A short thing. I just wonder, I'm with Keith's point, we have a weak plank when it comes to including conservative voices in our consideration on campus. So what would you have us do? And it's a weak PR plank, but it's also an intellectual integrity plank too. So what could we do more? And it also occurs to me that the term you're using there, Republican, is such a spectrum of opinion right now that one interesting thing
that
to do would be to invite Mark Boehner and Rand Paul, I suppose, so there's actually, I think, kind of good news in the lack of cohesion in those groups. But what would you say?
That is true.
To show the inclusiveness?
And in terms of the Republican, that we can go a long way on the route of Republican, res publica. That is what our society is so profoundly in need of, people to take responsibility for our shared obligations. Whether it's democracy or whether it's republic, going back to the roots, either way, I think you can deal with it. I'm not frankly, it's been so long since I have been in a department, and we have to be honest about that I cannot really tell you the best thing to do. But I bet there's people in this room who've addressed the question of engaging diverse perspectives, political perspectives, not just various kinds of ethnic and racial backgrounds. Michael, did you?
Michael, quickly.
We do a course in critical thinking for first-year students. It's a 20th century world problems course. One of the things we try to have students do, it's not across all sections, but I've done it and find it very successful, is teach them how to write a letter to the editor about an issue where they're forced to confront not just their own belief, which I agree, why I'm on this side of this issue, but to acknowledge in a respectful way the legitimacy of the opposite point of view. And I think we talk about, and the point I think you're trying to raise, in fact, is civic discourse has got to acknowledge the existence of multiple perspectives. And it's not just Republicans arguing against Democrats or right against wrong, whichever is right, whichever is wrong, but rather respect to one another. And that's an area I think we've lost, and if we can teach students to do that, we at least have some hope in future generations that eventually this is going to take hold.
Yeah. And of course the new movie Lincoln has just, to my mind, that was a public service. In that it showed both politics at its meanest and lowest, but at the same time in the service of a very high and important principle. And I think the opportunity to talk about not just engaging diverse perspectives, but actually working to a solution in the face of diverse perspectives. I think this is a moment when the resources in the popular culture have never been richer.
And these are good segues into my obligation to do the institutional flogging that one has to do. First of all, the AHA's website has a page that has links to a wide variety of commentaries on the Lincoln film by historians. There are at least, I think, about 10 or 12 at last count. If you know of any that you don't see on that page, please email Julia and she'll pass it along to the appropriate person. But you'll find that if you want to use Lincoln as in these kinds of ways in your class, this gives your students actually access to the different ways in which historians have engaged the film. Second, the AAC&U has a variety of different types of conferences, regional, national, where the kinds of issues that you're engaging on your campuses in tuning are on the table. As you can tell from what Carol's been talking about, we're really working down the same roads here. And I would very strongly encourage you to consider presenting at AAC&U conferences, whether it's the national conference or one of the regional conferences. There's information on their webpage. I think this is something that at many of your colleges and universities you will find a lot of support for. because it's a way of getting the institution out into a very important environment for education policy, places where I think a lot of institutions want to see their faculty have some visibility. So this is something I would very strongly encourage. And then third, what was the third? There was a flogging the age. Oh, I know. Third was where I was going to start. This whole conversation about respectful discourse, disagreement. The AHA's Statement on Standards of Professional Conduct for Historians has an absolutely fabulous, very short reference to this, to how one of the ethical principles that we as historians adhere to is this kind of respectful, civil disagreement based on evidence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think it appears in 2 different places, in different forms, and I know a lot of people have used that in your history classes, not only because it gives you a language that's been legitimated by the AHA, but also because I think it suggests to students and to people outside the discipline that historians in particular have a set of ethical commitments that relate to exactly what we were talking about, the campus itself as a forum for exploration of these kinds of questions.
That's really good to know. Maybe I should do a little flogging of our own website while Jim reminds me of it. A couple of things that may be useful for you in your broader responsibilities. AAC, before it gained its U, when it was just AAC, was the co-founder with AAUP of the Standards of Academic Freedom, and has been committed to that for a very long time. But fairly recently, within the last 5 or 6 years, we also wrote something called Academic Freedom and Educational Responsibility, which really goes to a number of the questions that we're talking about. A number of trustees, boards of trustees and directors have found it useful, but you might find it useful too. Just go to our website, it's a free download. It's a board of directors statement, and it's right there for you to use. And then secondly, in the same context, our board is also an official statement called on assessment, called Our Students' Best Work, an accountability framework worthy of our mission, which basically says very nicely some of the things I was trying to say before, that there ought to be rich, robust work by our students. They ought to know they're getting ready to do it. That's what they came for. And when they do it, that is the evidence that we need for assessment. We are strongly opposed to efforts to standardize and trivialize the questions we ask about our students' learning. We'll do everything we can to bring a humanistic perspective to that. And thirdly, I just want to some extent, we didn't do as much with the DQP as we might have in this discussion, but I really want to invite you all to give feedback on ways that the DQP could be strengthened, preferably using the document itself, not just my Cliff Notes on it, in light of the experience that you're having working on the tuning effort. The whole idea is to have tuning and DQP be 2 sides of the same coin. Here's the big framework for the degree. Here's what study in depth in particular fields looks like. A key part of the tuning, the DQP framing, is that there ought to be connections between majors and other parts of the curriculum. And there ought to be connections across general education courses. One of the things we asked ourselves was, why do we make students in the United States study in many different disciplines? Why don't we just do it the way they do it in England? They study one field in depth. And the answer has something to do with democracy. We think that students need to have that broad knowledge of science and society, et cetera, whatever they're majoring in. But then that means there need to be places where we help them bring the disciplines together in the analysis of a big problem. So that's what the DQP says now. I'd be most interested to hear how historians respond to that. We'd like your feedback. We will be meeting this spring to talk about some of the revisions we might make. By next year, we'll be doing it seriously. So this is your moment to help us try to get it right.
And if you do choose to help the AAC&U get it right, please copy Julia on your message so that we have a sense of what we're accomplishing with tuning.
Yes.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you so much.